Good evening YouTube, I'm Chucky2009 and tonight I'm going to be making a very highly requested video that deals with welding thicker material to thinner material. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially when they first start welding. It's something that a lot of people don't fully understand and have a lot of questions about. And I will say that this is something that I used to struggle with and that I was really curious about, but you know, I finally got it figured out, and although, you know, I don't want to sound like that guy that's just man up and deal with it, what I wish someone would have told me back in the day when I fired up the old coal-fired arc welder is, you know, a lot of the time, you just gotta shut up and weld it solid, and it'll probably be fine. Now that only goes so far, of course. Steel is one of, if not the easiest of the common materials to weld different thicknesses of. I know some things like aluminum, it can really be sort of a challenge. But the reality is, if you're welding like 3/16 to 1/4 inch, it's really not a big deal. If you're welding 1/8 inch to 3/16, really not a big deal. If you're welding 1/2 inch to 3/8, really not a big deal, and it's an even smaller deal if it's something that you use multiple passes on. So that's the first thing I'd like to point out. But as always, you know, there's a lot more to this than what seems to meet the eye, and I got some stuff over here I'd like to show you, and we'll take it from there. Now, the first thing you'll need to do when you go to weld two pieces of dissimilar thickness material is, of course, decide on what size of a weld you need to put down. And this is something that actually sounds a lot harder than it is. This quotation here sums things up pretty well. It just basically says, weld size need not exceed the thickness of the thinner part joint. And that's, of course, from the AWS D1.1. And essentially what that means is if you're welding a piece of 3/16 steel to some 5/8 plate, you only need a 3/16 fillet weld. The reason for that is because if you put down a larger weld, it's basically just wasted material, because assuming everything is done right, the material would fail before the weld. So if we put down like a 5/8 weld there instead of a 3/16, for instance, you know, there's not really any point, because obviously the 3/16 material is going to fail well before the weld. Now, once you decide what size weld you need to put down, the next thing is, of course, to figure out how exactly you're going to go about doing that. And generally, in a not too extreme case, like maybe 3/16 to 1/4 inch material, I'd just weld it, you know, how I would the 1/4 inch material and not really worry about it. It'd probably be fine. However, in a more extreme case where we're welding, say, 3/16 plate to 5/8 plate, I'd probably use, in this particular case, I don't know, I'd say about an 1/8 inch 70/18 stick electrode, because that's going to be a little bit larger than you'd normally want to weld 3/16 steel plate with, at least in my experience. You can do it definitely, but I feel like a 3/32 inch electrode would probably be the better choice for 3/16 to 3/16 in most cases. But, you know, we're going to be putting in a little bit more heat. We're going to have a little bit of a larger puddle, and that's going to work to help us fuse into that heavier 5/8 plate there. You know, if you've got a more extreme case like this than, say, 14 gauge to 1/2 inch or something, then I'd probably want to use like a 3/32 inch electrode and just work on focusing the heat onto that bottom plate. However, when you're working to focus heat like that, you got to be really careful that you don't end up with like a lopsided weld, because obviously that's not going to be any good. It's just something that, if possible, you want to make a practice run with. And there's a number of different things you can do. You know, you can use a smaller electrode, as mentioned, in an extreme case like that. And sometimes the smaller electrodes can be a little bit tricky to run if you're trying to limit your heat input and not burn through. You just completely like destroy the thinner piece of material. It's not the huge incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult thing that myself and I know a lot of other people think it is. It's something you have to practice with. It's something you have to think about. Remember that drawing, remember that phrase.